All right, we're going to talk about concatenative morphology, non-concatenative morphology, and a couple different ways that we can model all of these different processes. So when we have concatenative morphology, what we're looking at are morphemes that have some order. They go piece by piece. So this could be done through affixation. Let's say you have the word dog, and then you want to make a plural, so you can add S. Or you could do it even through something called compounding. And this is where you take two free morphemes and put them together. So a classic example is blackboard. So you can make blackboard. When you have non-concatenative morphology, you're looking at other patterns. You're looking at internal change. So you can talk about things like suppletion. So this is a case where you have go becoming went, as we saw in the previous video. Or you might have some sort of stress shift. You might have a change in tone. You might have part of the word being reduplicated, like in the word itsy bitsy. So there's a lot of different ways that we can do morphology, a lot of ways that we can create new words. So affixation and compounding are these basic concatenative processes. Let's say you have a word like inflection. You say you have this base called inflect, and then you're adding this affix or suffix, ion. Or in the case of skateboard, a lot like blackboard, we can break this down into two free morphemes. So that's affixation and compounding, pretty straightforward. So when we have these little suffixes like ion, we have to ask ourselves, what can it attach to? So in order to check things out, we can take a look at what are called the selectional restrictions of an affix. So the selectional restrictions are going to tell us what this affix full can attach to. What category of words is it attached to? So we have some examples here. Hopeful, careful, regretful, these are all fine, but exciteful, that's a verb, that's not good. Eatful, that's not good. Happyful, an adjective, that's not good. Tallful, another adjective, that's not good. It seems like words like hope, care, and regret, which are all nouns, is what full attaches to. So we could say that full has some certain selectional restriction. It has to attach to a noun. So in other words, here's the noun, and here is where this suffix is being attached. So how can we model this? Well, we can start by taking a look at morpheme-based models. So the whole point of a morpheme-based model is to ask how morphemes combine in a hierarchical structure. And the way that you do it is very similar to how you would do syntax. For instance, in syntax, you know that a sentence is going to consist of some determiner phrase or noun phrase like Charles, and some predicate VP like run. So it needs a subject and a predicate. It's going to be the same way with word structures. So we have this verb act, we can add this affix or to it, and we're going to get the noun in the end, actor. So this hierarchy, this tree, is going to tell us how the word is formed by breaking it down into its individual morphemes. So we have ways to model this. And we do these in little matrices. So there's three things that you have in the morpheme-based model. On the top, you have the pronunciation or the written form. This is essentially how it's pronounced or how it's written. So in this example, I have attack, and I have the suffix to make attacker if we put them together. So that's the pronunciation of attack, and that's the pronunciation of In the second line, this is where we're going to put either the category of the word, if it's a free morpheme, or we're going to put the selectional restrictions down if it's an affix. So on the left here, to attack is a verb. But when we take a look at well, on its own isn't a verb. What it does is it attaches to verbs and it creates a noun. So that's what we're writing here. We're saying it takes a verb on the left and then it attaches afterwards. And finally, This third line is going to be the meaning. So with regular verbs or regular forms, regular free morphemes, we can just put the meaning in quotations because as speakers of that language, we understand what it means. And for affixes, you may write down the purpose of that affix. So this is what's called an agentive affix. It creates a person out of the verb. Or you could even just shortcut it and say this is an affix that changes verbs to nouns. There's a couple different ways you can write this last line, but this is how the morpheme-based model is represented. What's important about this is that it assumes that everything is an individual morpheme. So every morpheme gets its own entry. So why this is important is that we can have words that are ambiguous. So the word unlockable is an ambiguous word because it can mean two different things. We have one structure on the left, so we'll call this structure 1, and we can see that lock and a bull are coming together first to make the adjective lockable. That thing is lockable. Now, we're adding the affix un to the adjective. So it was lockable, now it's unlockable, and this creates that new adjective unlockable. So the meaning of this is not lockable. But there's another way that we can do this, and we can call this interpretation number 2. First, we can take lock and then attach unto it to make the word unlock. So this is like reversing the process of locking. Now, we're going to take this suffix able and attach it to the verb unlock to get the adjective unlockable. Now, this has a slightly different meaning. This meaning is can be unlocked. It has the ability to be unlocked. So unlockable is ambiguous. It has two meanings, and we have two structures, one for each meaning, which is perfect because different structures should lead to different meanings. So let's take a look at a tree for a word, redepartmentalize. So if we have this, what we should be doing is finding our affixes and our roots. So we know that D is going to be an affix, part is going to be our, I think in this case, it's going to be a verb to make depart, which is a verb. Ment is going to be an affix here, and then when we get department, well, that is going to be a noun. A department is a thing. Departmental, that ol is going to be an affix, and that's going to combine with department to make departmental, which will be an adjective, like a departmental policy. Now we're going to add eyes to it, another affix, to get departmentalize, and this is going to be a verb. This is an action to departmentalize something. And finally, we can add our final affix, re, to do redepartmentalizing, or redepartmentalize. In other words, to do it again. And this will give us a verb as its output. So this would be the hierarchy for this structure, filled in with all of our categories. Now, we could also do little morpheme-based models for this. So, for instance, let's say we wanted to do part and just talk about that. Okay, so part, that's how you pronounce it. It's a verb, and what does it mean in this case? Well, it means depart. So that would be the lexical entry for that morpheme part. Let's do a lexical entry for this affix D. So duh, well, it's pronounced duh when you put it together with departmentalize. So duh, it's going to attach to a verb, and what it's going to do is it's going to create a new verb. So I'm not going to give it a meaning because I think it's a little bit difficult to nail down exactly what duh means in this case. So I'll just write its function. Its function is to take a verb and make it a verb. Now we could create some more, just one more for example. Let's do ol in this case. So it's pronounced ol. It is going to attach to a noun on the right side, and it's going to take a noun and convert it to an adjective. So department becomes departmental. So we could do a lexical entry, that's what we call these, for every single morpheme here. So if you want to try it, feel free, but I think we'll just move on from here. Now, concatenative morphology works nicely with these tree structures, but now we're going to jump into non-concatenative morphology, so things that happen word internally. So, for instance, with some words, the inside changes. So, for example, mouse, ow, becomes mice. So we get this vowel change between the singular and plural. We see that same pattern with louse and lice. In Dutch, we see a vowel change too for the singular and plural. The vowel a becomes eh, so man to mend, or gas to guess. So that is the difference between singular and plural. In a case like Albanian, it might even be the final sound that changes. So it doesn't have to be something in the middle. It could be something at the beginning, something at the end. But we do see a sound change there as well. Now, how would we do this with the tree? If we were to have mouse, and we know this is a noun, and we want to make it plural, well, normally if we add an affix to it, it adds something to the end of the word. So what we would have to do is say, hey, there's nothing there, but it means plural, and our output is mice. Now, a lot of people aren't very happy with this sort of analysis, so we have an alternative. And that is what's called the word-based model. Now, in the word-based model, you don't have entries for each individual morpheme. Instead, you only have entries for complete words. And what you do with these complete words is you find patterns across words. So for instance, we just see two lines here. This is love. It's a verb that has the meaning of love. And then we have its counterpart, loved. So we see the same thing. Loved, it's a verb. Its meaning is loved. The difference here is that we get a D at the end. That's the only thing that's really changing between these two forms. Now let's take a look at another example. Rub. Okay, there's the pronunciation of rub. It's a verb. Now we have rubbed again. It's also a verb. And we see that D being added too. So what the word-based model does is it looks for patterns to generalize across. So we can use variables for this. So what this is going to look like is we're going to say, okay, if we have a verb that's the form of whatever, so we'll just call this X. We're going to use a variable. Maybe that's love, maybe that's rub. We don't know. It could be any verb. So that's going to be a general pattern for what we see with these top forms. Now with these bottom forms, what's the general pattern here? Well, if we compare it to our original, there's still some part that's the same, love and rub. That's not changing. But these forms have a D at the end. So this is going to be XD. It's also a verb, and the meaning of this is going to be X, but in the past. So what we can do is we can create what's called a morphological correspondence between those two. And what it's saying is that if you have a word form that looks like X, that's a verb, X can be whatever, you can just add a D sound to it, and then you can get the past form of that verb. So in other words, let's say I have a word like ski. Well, ski here is going to be X, so when we make the past tense form, we have ski, and then we're going to add a D to it to get skied. Oh, it works. Lovely. So this is how we can model affixation as we're just seeing, but we can also use this to model things that happen word internally. So let's see how we can do that. So here are our German examples, Mond to mend and Gas to gas. So we can kind of see the connection here. So we can ask ourselves, looking across these words, well, what's the pattern? What's changing? So the ah to a is changing in both of these cases. But what we see is that the beginnings and the ends of these forms are staying exactly the same. So we want to somehow write a schema. Let's just write the base here, where we have something that's a noun. We have the form in X, and what we're going to get is X plural out of it. So we want the ah to change to an a, but we don't want anything else to change. So how we're going to do this is we're going to say, okay, everything to the left is just X. Like, who knows what it is? It's X. It's not changing. It's going to stay the same. And everything to the right of A is just going to be Y. It's going to be something different. Doesn't matter what it is, but it's going to stay the same. Now, if we create a morphological correspondence, we can say that the singular form is something and ah and then something else, while the plural form is going to be something and a and then something else. But whatever those somethings are, they're going to stay the same between the two forms. So we can pick a whole new word. We could make some fake word like knock. So n is going to be our x here, k is going to be our y. When we go to the plural form, we'd end up with n. That's our x, that's not changing. A is changing, and then k is our y. So knock to neck. So that's how we can use the word-based model to show internal change. So let's try another one, and this is an interesting case of interact, interaction, construct, construction. So with the word-based model, we're basically trying to find some parallels between these two forms. So what we might think is what we might do in this case is look at everything that's similar. So in both cases, interact, interaction, construct, construct. And now what's going to be different here? Well, the T is being changed to a shun in both of these cases. So I think we know how to do this. We can say that we have some form X with a T at the end. Interact is what? Interact is going to be a verb. So this is just whatever X is. And this is going to be in a correspondence with, well, everything in X is going to be the same, but that T is going to change to a shun. And interaction is going to be a noun. So we can say the meaning is X, and this is just the ION form. Again, I'm just going to keep it simple because the meanings aren't always super easy to nail down. So now we can see this correspondence. We could take a word like react. So there's react. That's our X. And in order to get the other form, we're going to keep react the same. And then we're going to change the t to shun. So we get reaction. Oh, there you go. Looks good. All right. So what you might notice from this is that something weird is happening. This T is on its own for interact and construct. So if you look at this model, you might think, hey, is this T a morpheme? Because you look at shun and you're like, oh, that corresponds to ION in written English. So is this one a morpheme? But the thing about the word-based model is that it doesn't think about morphemes. It doesn't care about morphemes. It's not claiming that T is a morpheme or that shun is a morpheme. All it's doing is saying that there's two forms of these words that interact with each other. So morphemes are not important for this model. Okay, let's try another example. And this one is a little bit interesting. So we have masculine and feminine forms in French. So normally when you do a problem, your brain is hardwired into looking left to right. So we have a word for big in the masculine form, and then in the feminine, we're adding a D. That's what it looks like. Chaud to chaud, we're adding a D. Froid to froid, adding a D. Now it gets a little bit weirder as we go on, because we think we have this nice predictable pattern of add D to make the feminine. But we're adding Z in one case, blanc to blanche in one case, so a sh is being added, and lourd to lourd. So adding a G there. So if you were to ask the question, how do we model this? The initial thought is to say we're going to take X and we're going to add X and add some consonant, and maybe we have some way to figure out what the consonant is. But this actually is not the way to go about it. We need to reverse our thinking. Maybe the feminine is the base form, so we have X and some consonant at the end. So there's a final consonant in the word, and we'll say this is going to be the feminine form. And what's actually happening is that last consonant is getting removed to make the masculine form. So really we're going from feminine to masculine. And this makes this really easy to model, because if we do our little morpheme-based model here, we have XC. This is going to be a noun. The C just stands for a consonant at the end of the word there. This is going to be a feminine form, and it's going to correspond with another case of X, that's a noun, and this is the masculine form. So we can see here that this C essentially is being deleted. But another thing about the word-based model is that it's not biased in direction. In this case, it's not saying that the feminine becomes masculine or the masculine becomes feminine. It's just saying there is a correspondence between these two forms. The feminine has something plus a consonant at the end. The masculine form is the same thing, but without that consonant, and you can switch between the two. It's not making any judgments about what that consonant is, just that the two abstract forms exist, and this is how they correspond with each other. You could use the morpheme-based model to form a rule or something like this. And it might be a little bit difficult to do that in a tree structure, because the feminine form is there first, and then you remove something to get the masculine form. But there's probably some way that it can be done. But the morpheme-based model doesn't really work well with these non-concatenative morphology things. So we just did French subtraction. Let's take a look at another process called backformation. So backformation looks a lot like subtraction. We have the word babysitter here, and from babysitter we get the verb to babysit. From donation, we get the verb to donate. From sedative, we get the verb to sedate. Now, unlike deletion, backformation occurs when you have something that looks like an affix. So we think that we have the word babysit, and then we add ER to get babysitter. But actually, historically, the words on the left, babysitter, donation, and sedative came first, and the verbal forms came afterwards. So speakers thought that these were affixes and then removed them to make other forms of words based on their knowledge of the language. So this can be a very similar process with babysitter and babysit. You have X, ER, and this is going to correspond with X, where XER is a noun and X is just a verb. So I'm sort of shortening those lexical entries there to get the point across. Or donation, you might have XION, so this is the noun form, and then that corresponds with just X, which is the verb form. So that is backformation. Looks very similar to subtraction, and in a model you might not even be able to tell the difference. This is more of a historical reason for why these occur, and that's how they're classified. If you're looking at anything above the sound layer, so above individual sounds, if you're looking at things like tone or stress or pitch, you're looking at things called suprafixes. And to demonstrate that, we can take a look at English. English has a lot of two-syllable words that can be a noun or verb depending on where the stress is. So in number 1, record, we have stress on that first syllable, and that's a noun form. But if we change the stress and put it on the second syllable, we get record, a verb. So there's a stress difference between these two forms, and they correspond with each other. So we can do this with word schema too. It's actually quite straightforward. So we use the syllable symbol, so these are little sigmas. So we can say if the first syllable is stressed, and it's a noun, then it has some noun form X. And this corresponds with a verbal form where you have two syllables too, but the second one gets stressed. It's a verb, and this just means to X. So that's the verbal form. So this shift, this stress change, the shift in stress can be modeled in our word schemas as well. So it's a two-syllable word, stress is on the beginning, it's a noun. If stress is on the second syllable, it's a verb. This won't work with all words, but this can be generalized for quite a few English words. So let's take a look at something with tone. So this is Kanuri mood, and we have conjunctive mood and optative mood for each of these verbs. Conjunctive mood just means that you can chain another verb afterwards, and it just means and. So go and, rest and, study and. So we'll put and above here. The optative is like a hope to. So optative go would be I hope to go, I hope to rest, I hope to study, I hope to bring. Now what we notice about these forms is that the only thing changing here is the tone. It's going from a low tone to a rising tone, and everything else is staying the same. So what we can do, and we know exactly which sound it is, there's some X, and if we have a tone on an A at the end, this is a verb, this is going to be in your conjunctive form, and this is going to correspond with that same X, but the A at the end will be a higher tone, that'll be a verb, and this is going to be your optative form. So another example of a suprafix in our models, just shifting between the low tone and high tone. Now we might say, well, what if it isn't always the A sound? Well, maybe we might want to generalize then. In fact, I'll just do this as shorthand. So we might want to say it's XV with low tone, corresponding to XV with a high tone there. So maybe that's another way that we could write that out. But again, you can see how we can do this with both stress and tone. Another process, we have these more of these word internal processes. So something is called lengthening. That's when you make a sound longer. So instead of k, it becomes k. It's probably hard to hear with a consonant, but with a vowel it might be easier. So E versus E. And we have this in English. So if you take the word beat and you take the word bead, E in beat is short and E in bead is longer. Beat, bead. Might not be that noticeable, but that change exists. In English, we also see this with some words that have a morpheme being attached to them, and we see this at the boundary point. So, for example, with unnatural, we don't say the N twice, so we don't say unnatural. Instead, we just make this N longer and say unnatural. Or innumerous, not innumerous, just innumerous. So we're lengthening that N instead of repeating the sound twice. Now we could model that, but I think that's probably not too bad at this point. A really interesting case is called reduplication, and this is where the morpheme-based model tends to struggle and the word-based model prevails. So let's take a look at this data. We have amper, which means nearly, and if we duplicate the word, we get amper amper, which means very nearly. If you get deek, that's thick, deek deek, very thick. Dry, three, dry dry, three at a time. So there's just a whole repetition of the form in order to make the very form or the three at once form. So a few different forms depending on which type of word is being attached to. So there's a really easy way to do this in the word-based model. What we can do is we can say these words have the form X. So who knows what they are? It's just X. And to get the reduplicated form, we just repeat X twice. So X is in morphological correspondence with XX. And this makes a new form. So pretty nice. With the morpheme-based model, we might be able to get something like amper in here, but how does it know what to reduplicate? What do you put in that affix in order to get amper amper? So some people would say that there's just a reduplicative affix there that just takes whatever it's attached to. Maybe that's a way to solve it, but I don't think it's quite as elegant as the word-based model. Now here's where things get a little bit messy. What happens when there's two different types of reduplication happening at the same time? And what I mean by this is there's going to be a case of full reduplication where you take the whole word and reduplicate it, and there's going to be a case here of partial reduplication. And this is where you just take part of the word and reduplicate it. So let's ask ourselves what the different types of meanings are here. So we go from tau to ta-tau. So we're adding ta here. It looks like we're reduplicating that first CV. What about marrow? Marrow is boy, and we get marrow, so boys. So we're reduplicating that initial CV. So what partial reduplication is going to do is it's going to look at the singular form and the plural form and make a correspondence between them. So you could have something like CVX, and this is going to correspond with, well, we're going to reduplicate the first consonant vowel, so we get CVCVX. And the X is just whatever's afterneath, or whatever's after is just going to remain the same. So you could think of it as tau, and then you're going to get ta, tau for man and men. Now, what is reduplication doing? Well, for full reduplication, we're going to take a look at marrow, and that's boy. Then little boy below is marrow. So it's reduplicating the whole word to make it little, or this like diminutive form. So this is taking a noun, and it's corresponding with little noun. So what we can do here is we can use the same model as before. It's taking X, and it's just repeating the whole word to get XX, and that's what's making that shift there. So if X is tau, then if we wanted man to be little man, so tau, then we just reduplicate tau. We reduplicate the whole thing. So these two interact together, and we can see this in the case of little boys. So we have marrow, it gets reduplicated partially to get marrow, and then you take the whole thing and you reduplicate it again to get that little meaning, and then you get mamero. So two different cases of reduplication happening at the same time. Now, we don't have to make this nice magical lexical entry where everything is connected because we see exactly how it's done here. Sure, there's an order in which it has to happen, but the word-based model doesn't care too much about the order in which things occur. So, one more here, another case of partial reduplication. So Somali has this reduplication where you get partial reduplication, but part of that partial reduplication depends on something else in the word. So we think of it as like a mix of an affix and reduplication. We call this a duplifix. So to demonstrate this, we have boog, okay? And then book. And then in other words, to make the word books, we do boog, and then we add ag, so ag. For fool, we're going to say fool al, so we're adding al. And kob, we're adding ab, kob ab. Jid, jid ad. So what do we notice about all of these? Well, if you write them out, ag, al, ab, and ad, there's something that we have in common here. There's an ah there. But this consonant afterwards seems to be somewhat random. Or is it? Well, if we take a look at the final sound in the root here, and we write it down, we actually see that this final sound is being partially reduplicated. So this consonant is going to depend on the consonant in the base. So, in other words, this is going to be our plural form, XCAC. So we don't really care what comes before this final consonant. In the case of boo, like these are our X's here, boo, fo, ko, and G. Doesn't matter. What matters is the final consonant in the root, and then adding ah, and then reduplicating that final consonant. So this is going to correspond with the forms of XC, where this is our singular form. So XC, the final C is being reduplicated, and then we're adding an I in between. So really cool way we can do this in a word-based model, morpheme-based model. It's just not going to work out nicely. Now, saving one of the most boring ones for last, it's called conversion. The conversion happens when the word itself does not change. The pronunciation is exactly the same, but it has a category shift. So the word bottle. Bottle can be a noun, or it can be a verb to bottle. Fish can be a noun, or it can be the verb to fish. So this correspondence is quite simple. It's the form X with the noun, and we don't have to change anything, and it becomes a verb. So a nice morphological correspondence there. This happens in other languages too, so here we can see some tone on these words, but it's exactly the same. You have a form X that's a noun, and it corresponds with that exact same thing that happens to be an adjective. Not too bad. So here's the final exercise for this video. See if you can figure out what the pattern here is, and write a morphological correspondence between two word schemas. So let's take a look at this. We have some forms on the left which are going to be adjectives or adverbs, and then on the right we have the intense version of those, so very red, very long. So let's take a look at what happened. I'm going to start with the bottom one. So we have shinge, and it looks like what's happening is at the beginning we're adding sheep. Okay, and I should be very careful about which vowels I'm writing and making sure I'm writing the correct ones, because this will matter. What I'm noticing right away is that we have some reduplication here. So it's like we're adding she, and then there's this P coming out of nowhere. So let's see if we get the same pattern looking at other things. Okay, let's do the second one long. So oo, zoom. Okay, how do we make the very long form? Well, it looks like we're adding U and a P. Okay, interesting. So we're reduplicating the first sound here and adding a P. But we're not reduplicating the same amount as in that other word. So maybe we should do one more just to check our pattern. Let's do the third one for quickly. So this is going to be turgen, and this will change to turgen. So let's add this turgen, and it looks like we're doing the same thing. We're adding a P in between a partially reduplicated morpheme there, so a duplifix. Okay, so what it looks like is that part of a syllable is being reduplicated. There's either going to be a CV that's reduplicated or just a V. So how we can model this is we can say, and here's where something new comes in, we can say there's an optional C in this rule, there's a V, and then there's something else afterwards. So this is going to be our base form. So these are our adjectives or our adverbs. Okay, and this is going to correspond with, well, what we're going to do here is we're going to, if we have a C, we'll repeat the C, we'll repeat the vowel, we'll add a P. Again, that C is optional, and then we'll get the remainder of what we had before. So this is going to be the same thing, adjective or adverb, and this is the form very X. So whatever X is, we're going to get very X. So as we can see here in our form, we're just going to reduplicate the first two sounds. If there's a consonant, we'll reduplicate that. If there's not, we'll ignore it. And then we're going to add a P in the middle of that. And that's going to be able to give us all of the forms that we have below. So I think that these two models are quite cool. I love the word-based model. I just love the patterns there, how you can take a bunch of words and find these abstract connections and generalizations across all of them in order to create other forms. So that's it for this one. I hope you liked it, and I'll see you in the next one.